Welcome to Negotiation Made Simple, where we help you master the art of negotiation and win the next deal. I'm your host, John Lowry. In this episode, we are going to take a hard look at workplace negotiation. Those moments where you have to negotiate with bosses and colleagues and clients and employees. The workplace is ripe for negotiation. And in order to be a great teammate, in order to be a great leader, negotiation will be a critical part of your skill set. And I'm excited. Joining us for this conversation is a longtime friend, Chris Allen. Chris is the founder and the CEO of Always About People, a consulting and leadership development firm where Chris spends his time going and working with organizations in terms of developing culture, working with executive teams and how to work together most productively, and working with leaders across the organization in terms of how leaders can really care about people and create an environment where the workplace becomes a place where people can thrive, where people are comfortable, where people are fulfilled. All of that happens because of negotiation and because of the way people work out their problems and find ways to work together. And so let's jump into this really important conversation with Chris Allen. I really want to start with kind of anchoring this conversation in some kind of real life scenarios. Like, what are you seeing in terms of areas where people have to negotiate as they think about their workplace and as they think about their professional roles?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because as you were even kind of doing the setup, I was trying to think, most people probably don't refer to it as negotiation. Mm-hmm. So the word, it might not be used in common terminology, but it always is negotiation. They just might refer to it as I'm working through some conflict, or sure, how do I have hard conversations, sure, or how do we set some policies in place, or how do we do change management more effectively? Well, all of those are forms of negotiation. We just probably think like in the workplace, typically we wouldn't use that terminology. So what I'd love to do is maybe reframe for people how all of those conversations are actually forms of negotiation. One of the funny ones, I was thinking of it while you were talking about leader calling you and saying, well, I'm calling you because I've got a problem. The one that I get is, hey, Chris, all of this would be so much easier if people weren't involved. And and it makes me laugh. They laugh all the time too. But the reality is, anytime people are involved, mm-hmm, there's going to be tension, there's going to be conflict, and there's going to be a need for negotiation. So mm-hmm, I don't know if I specifically answered your question about specific instances, but what I think about negotiation, I think there's negotiation on a daily basis between two people because conflict or tension is inevitable in mm-hmm, relationship. And mm-hmm, those are the things that we need to give people the skills to work through on their own, versus going to a manager or some supervisor and saying, hey, I need someone to get involved to help us through this. So that could be a specific skill set we talk through.
Yeah, I appreciate your point in terms of people not necessarily describing it as negotiation or even seeing themselves as negotiators. In the book, Negotiation Made Simple, I define negotiation as a strategic communication process to get a deal or solve a problem. And those three things people do identify in terms of having to communicate to either put together a deal or to solve a problem. And folks would recognize and say, and when I interview people or poll people, they say, yeah, I spend 70%, 80% of my time putting deals together or solving problems. Like, that's my job. That's what I do. And much of that is internal, which is really where I'm excited to have some conversation with you in terms of how do they put deals together? How do they solve problems with the people that they work with? And what's interesting about this conversation, and we can kind of start here, is that it's a little bit more dynamic because there is a relationship that matters. There is a culture that sets expectations, but also is something that everyone has to be a steward of. But then there's also the issue that's very important, and that it could be a principle, it could be a value, it could be a resource, something that's really critical to people. But one of the challenges of negotiating at work is you have to do it in this context of relationships with the people that you work with and the culture that you do your work in.
Yeah. So we use the phrase belief drives behavior. And I think in any behavior that you see in an organization, there is an underlying belief in that. The other thing we talk about is when we define culture, we say it's the patterns of behavior that are either encouraged or tolerated by people and processes over time. And so there are behaviors within an organization, and they are rooted in some sort of a belief system. So when you come to a negotiation, what you're really dealing with are two individuals who are behaving out of a deep-seated belief or a belief system. And so we have to identify what that belief system is at first. And unfortunately, we live in a society today where the prevailing belief system is I matter and I got to do my thing, what matters most to me. And with a scarcity mindset, I believe that we're playing some sort of a game where I win and you lose. And therefore, almost any negotiation goes south if that's the conclusion. I got to win and you have to lose because there's only so much to go around. And that's my belief. So here's my behavior. And unless I can win, John, this conversation is over.
And the fundamental premise of that, number one, is wrong. And so that's the first thing, is trying to help people create a new mindset in that. And that really becomes this problem-solving approach to negotiation that starts with empathy. It actually starts with understanding the other side, not just seeking for you to be understood. But then this whole notion, too, of saying that, there is this zero-sum thing out there. And in some instances, there is. There are, commercial deals involving money to where there's only so much of it. And in some cases, that's how it is. But internally, as we think about the workplace environment, many times that's not the case. And so really, it's not about winning to the point that other people are losing. It's about finding a way in which we can mutually achieve our interest and move this forward in a way where everyone benefits. Now, the reason that I think that people struggle to get there, some of it's because of their beliefs, but some of it's just because of their lack of skill set. They just don't know how to do that. The only thing they know is, well, here's a moment of conflict. I fear that I may not get my way. And my natural reaction is to be very combative and competitive. And the challenge with that, as you know, which I want to hear you reflect on a little bit, is in those environments where that behavior becomes the preferred way of trying to work through a problem or a moment, even if you win on the issue, you still lose in terms of the overall relationship, and the culture loses in terms of tolerating that behavior and now having that impact in terms of everyone seeing that and how it played out.
Yeah. So let's go a little bit into the science of people. Yeah. And what we're really seeing in that moment that you just described is a fear button that's being pushed in a human being. And so there's an emotional feeling, there's a response, and what's happening in the brain of a person is the fear response, which we typically simplify as flight, fight, or freeze. And so now the fight would be 1/3 of that fear response. And so what's really happening is the amygdala is firing off a stress response, and we're getting fear in a person, which becomes reactionary. So a person's rational brain is not stimulated under fear. They are simply reacting. And so unless people have the tools to actually begin to rationally think through conflict, tension, negotiation, what we're really seeing out of people, human beings, is a reaction in that moment to a fear mechanism. Now, John, we're seeing this everywhere in society right now. I mean, spend any amount of time on media. It's not even a political issue. It could be anything. There are just these fear triggers that are going off, and everybody's just freaking out and responding. And I think we're seeing sort of the ramifications of that in the workplace, particularly with another generation that's not being given the skill sets to stop, pause, and with a level of emotional intelligence, understand, oh, I know what's going on. That's my fear response. Let me take a deep breath. Let me resettle back into a rational response. Let me take these skills of negotiation and think through actions so that I don't regret it later. And that's the part of, I think, human behavior and really leadership development that we need to train people in. Because it can be taught and learned.
Yeah, really powerful point. I love the fact that you brought that up in terms of, how the brain works. And this is really, really important for managers. And that is when a moment comes, oftentimes people are going to run to you as the leader or run to you as the manager, which actually is not a healthy thing. You really want to equip your people to deal with problems at their level. They know how best to deal with them. But when there's not the skill set to deal with them, or they're ineffective in communicating and working with each other, they are naturally going to run to the leader. And many times when they do, they will run and they will actually be driven by their emotions, like you just said. So they're not coming in to have a rational conversation and to step back and to think rationally about it. They're coming in to communicate however their brain, which is not rationally thinking in the moment, whatever solution that their brain has come up with that will get them back to a place of safety and remove that fear, that's what they're going to come in with. And one of the challenges for managers, and I'd love to hear, your thoughts on this as well, is that's a moment where you got to take control of the process and the environment before you actually deal with the problem. Because you're not dealing with a rational person. And if you start to try to have a rational conversation with them, you're going to find them to be very combative, very difficult, and they're going to have a hard time understanding and appreciating the perspective of the other side. And so what I've seen some managers do is just listen in those moments. Just let them pour it out. I've heard some people describe it as let them empty their cup and then say, I've heard you. I understand and appreciate where you're coming from. Why don't we do this? Let's take a day to kind of think about some potential solutions. Let's get back together. Maybe we do it in a different environment where people can feel safe, and let's just think together. And by taking control of that process, creating that safety in terms of people knowing that they've been heard, knowing that there is a process in place to solve that problem, to remove that fear, and then to have them show up the next day ready to be more productive. I've found that, and others that I've coached that have done that have reported that that's a useful first step in trying to deal with that moment when emotions are high.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think the pause, take a time out, change of location, change of scenery, all that. By the way, John, it kind of made me laugh because I was thinking well, that's what we do with our kids too in parenting. Yeah. It's like when a human being is elevated emotionally, that the rational brain is not there to handle the situation. So let me control the situation as best I can. Let me remove the person from the high stress environment, and let's figure out how to come back to this. Another really effective tool, which could be combined, is just to simply ask questions, because oftentimes the person isn't asking the rational questions in that moment.
Sure.
You might have to remove the person from the stressful situation. Uh-huh. But then the idea of just saying, hey, why is it that you feel this is such a threat? And get to the root cause of the belief system in that individual. Because the fear response is a fear to some sort of a threat. And this is an amazing system within our bodies that protects us from a bear jumping out in the woods or some sort of a threat that's actually dangerous. But that same system that can help us in some situations becomes really dangerous to relationships in conflict or negotiation. And so I think getting to the root of, hey, help me understand why you feel this way. Help me understand why you feel like this is such a threat to you. Help me, walk me through your feelings. Why do you feel this way? And that is a form of listening, but it's also an active form of listening, which is just to say, I'm going to guide you through the rational thought process. Oftentimes it's the irrational thought process, but I'm going to walk you through this to help you understand what's going on right now is a fear response. That's not actually what's happening. Let's walk through how we can solve this thing together, and a win-win, a way to, both get a win out of this in our relationship going forward. So anyway, good thoughts.
Yeah, no, great stuff. And one of the pitfalls that managers have to be careful of as well is in many cases, managers and leaders do have the power within the organization to make a decision and to solve the problem. Yet that is a power that has to be used very carefully and very judiciously. Because if that power gets used, then you do create that environment to where you have winners and losers. And talk about cultures where there are winners and losers. What happens to the winners, especially when they win through bad behavior, and what happens to the losers in a work environment?
Well, the ultimate outcome is that people don't stay in organizations like that. Yep. And so what happens when we tolerate certain behavior, and by tolerate, I'm kind of thinking, okay, we've got winners, and those winners might not be winning fairly. They're just bullies, or under sort of whatever sort of conflict avoidance strategies we've developed, the strongest voice, the loudest voice, the most angry person wins. And we tolerate that in an organization, that quickly becomes the culture. And so ultimately then what people figure out is when they come into a situation where the loudest person wins, the angry person wins, the person who throws a temper tantrum gets their way, that is a learned behavior. And it becomes now the pattern of behavior that teaches everybody else in the culture that's how you get your way. And so social conformity is a very real concept within the world, but within the workplace. And people conform to the behaviors that they see. The longer we tolerate a behavior in an organization, the more it actually becomes the culture. So everything that we've done to encourage a specific culture, to build values, to encourage certain behaviors, can be lost in a moment by just simply tolerating the poor behavior or the violent behavior or the angry behavior of an individual that completely goes against what we're trying to build and encourage. But without us even really being intentional, just by allowing it or tolerating, we can change the course of a culture. Now, what happens first is division. So you have two cultures going on. One that's really trying to follow the mission, the vision, the values that we've put in place, and one that's actually how people behave. And so now you have this warring culture within an organization of people who are like, hey, that's not who we said we were going to be. Hey, wait a minute, I thought this is who we were going to be. And now you have the tension within a culture that typically begins to build two sides. And eventually what happens is that your best performers, your A players on the side that is trying to actually behave in alignment with the organization will eventually leave out of frustration because they won't want to win this other way. And so I think what you end up having is you have retention issues, you have attrition as a result of allowing the culture to go on.
Yeah, really powerful point there. The way that I like to describe it in some of my coaching work is, an organization has stated values, and that's what we put on the wall and we put in our decks and, all that kind of stuff. But then every organization also has unstated values. And it's the alignment that matters. And what you just described was really powerful. When you allow unstated values to take hold in your organizations, especially when they conflict with the stated values, you create massive misalignment and it becomes really, really challenging. And so that's kind of where the negotiation piece comes in. And the piece of this that's interesting, I think, and perhaps can be some help practically for people is to understand that in negotiation, there are two aspects. There is substance and there is process. The substance is what is the right answer. And everyone has their opinion as to what is the right answer. I think one of the things, Chris, that we need to talk about is the big negotiation that's going on in the workplace right now about how people work and where people work. Before there wasn't much negotiation, but then COVID happened and people realized I can work from home on Fridays and be just as productive, or I can work from home all week and be just as productive. Why do I need to come to the office at all? And yet in those moments, substantively, there is a right answer there. But one of the challenges that organizations are dealing with right now is, okay, how do we get everyone to the right answer? And that becomes the really strategic decision for people to make if you're leading an organization, but this is a critically important decision to make when you are involved in conflict in terms of thinking about how you're going to manage yourself personally, is how am I going to get that other person to the right answer? And that how and how you answer that question, that's the behavior that you just described. And if people can pause long enough to think strategically as opposed to just instinctively about that, how am I going to get other people to the right answer, then there's a lot of problems that can get solved, but can get solved in a way that promotes and advances the alignment with the stated values of the organization.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you've kind of brought up this idea of a big negotiation that's happening around how we work and where we work.
Yeah.
And, obviously the world moved to a remote workforce pretty quickly in 2020, 21. Mm-hmm. People got used to it. The individual employee found great benefit, maybe financially, in the reduction of the cost of fuel and gas, mm-hmm. the time that they got back from their commute to work, some in the quiet focus of their own home and not the distraction of an environment. What we lost was community. Mm-hmm. What we lost was relationship. What we lost was collaboration. Mm-hmm. What we lost was innovation and experimentation. And so that's now left a negotiation to be made between a workplace or leadership and the individual employee, mm-hmm. who saw great benefits, but some of the drawbacks aren't as visible or as known to the individual. And so What I'm now seeing is that leadership is saying, okay, we're returning to office. Come back, get back in the office, and it's typically been communicated with an email that goes out with some formal HR language that basically says, hey, you've had this incredible benefit. We're now wanting to bring people back into the office. And sometimes these communications are sort of hitting on community, innovation, collaboration, and all that, but they tend to be really quick bullets. And so the individual reads that communication and goes, oh, great, they want to take away this benefit from me. And now we have tension. We have a negotiation that needs to be made between an individual who truly doesn't buy in and believe that going back to the office is going to be beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
On the other side, we have leadership that is sometimes convinced that people do not work at home, that they are wasting time, that they are not being productive. And I would argue that's not fully true either, that belief system has flaws, because I can show you proof that even when people had their butts in the seats in the office, they were wasting time, being unproductive, viewing things on the internet, whatever, shopping, etc. There's plenty of data on that. So at some point, both sides of this negotiation are coming with some misbelief, beliefs of their own, and now we have a negotiation. So, John, give us the skills, I guess. How do we begin to get into that conversation? I can tell you what's happening in the workplace. And the way the negotiation is met is like, well, I'm the leader. This is what we're doing. You will be back in the office for X number of days. And there's not really any conversation. It's just get back. And so now the individual employee has to decide, okay, I either go back to the office or go find another job. And there's no sort of middle ground in that decision-making process. And so that's where I feel like the skill set in let's negotiate this thing out. I've got a few thoughts on successful ways that I've seen that work, but I'll pause there and let you respond.
Well, let me share a couple of ideas that are kind of universal in terms of what you want to try to achieve here. But then I'm really interested in hearing about how you've seen this absolutely messed up in terms of the management of this negotiation. I'm really interested in hearing the train wreck, but then I'm also interested in hearing where you've seen it done well, because I think that would really benefit people. As I think about this moment, if you were to call me and say, hey, I need help with this negotiation, the first place I'd start is trying to figure out what are the shared values that people will connect with. And do they think that collaboration with colleagues is important? Do they think that figure out what is it that those things that people can truly align to? And then go through the process of affirming those things, hearing those things, identifying those things, getting those things out on the table before you announce anything, so that whatever decision gets made, number one, you have established that you have carefully listened to everyone and all the different perspectives, as opposed to what lots of people think, and that is that, oh, leadership was having a meeting and they didn't like the numbers this quarter. And so they just decided that for all of us to be more productive and more profitable, we have to be in the office. And part of the reaction there is it's bad process. And people react not because they necessarily object to the decision, they react to the fact that they weren't considered and their perspective wasn't heard prior to the decision. And so that would be the first thing. And then the second thing, where I think a lot of this is that organizations under kind of the umbrella of equity feel like they need to have a policy that is one size fits all. And so what happens is that they announce the policy. Well, that policy may work for 80% of the workforce, but for 20%, there are very legitimate reasons why a different work in the office versus at home balance might make a lot of sense. And so in crafting the policy, creating some flexibility that allows people in individual situations to be able to have something different without other people feeling like it's totally unfair, that is really wise to do in terms of thinking about a solution that, yes, achieves equity, but also recognizes that there are people with legitimate needs that differ from their colleagues that may be more accommodated through a different kind of working environment. And so having a flexible solution, I think there's a lot of wisdom to that as well.
That's great. So I'm in full agreement. Let me give you kind of a little bit of a scientific concept or
Sure.
construct, and then we'll go from there. Self-determination theory says that there are three things that every human being wants in work and in life. They want competence. They want to feel competent. They want autonomy. They want to feel like they have some ability to control how they get things done. And relationship or relatedness. So I want to feel competent. I need some form of autonomy, and I like being in relationship. Well, the scenario gone bad is one where you take away all three by simply making a leadership decision around a conference table in an executive conference room. Because one, you need to fill the building. Two, you just feel like people need to be back in the office. Three, you make assumptions over a lack of productivity. There's no real data backing it up. And we make this decision, a blanket statement that then goes through the communications department, checks all the boxes, and we roll out a communication only to be met with, oh my goodness, we didn't think through all of that.
Sure.
We didn't think through the fact that some people were already working out of the office. We didn't think through the fact that there were some individuals who already had exceptions. We didn't think through all of this stuff. And so one scenario gone really bad was a blanket statement that went out, returned to work, but then they realized that they had granted exceptions prior to COVID. And by going out with a blanket statement, they had to now revisit every exception. And there were individuals who had been granted exceptions prior to COVID who were denied exceptions under the new policy. Now you have a communication nightmare because people are like, you guys don't even know what you're doing. You don't even understand people. All right. So self-determination theory, we want to make people feel competent. Well, you've just taken away their competence. You've basically called them unproductive, and you've told them that they're not responsible or accountable. You've taken away their autonomy because they have no authority at all in this decision-making process. It's being forced on them, and now you're telling them how they need to do work. And the relationship that we've worked so hard to establish, you've pretty much destroyed it because you just don't believe in them. So on the flip side, the positive way to go about it would be in total alignment with everything that you just said, which is how can I create an environment where I'm able to express my needs, my desires as a leadership team, but I'm also able to make sure that every employee feels some level of competence, a level of autonomy, and a level of relatedness. I think the best approach is to just say, okay, how could I give managers who are competent some level of autonomy in relationship because they actually know their people better than the executive team who's writing a policy in a conference room. And so how can I give managers some level of discretion by granting exceptions to individuals on their team who know their team, who know productivity, who understand the unique needs of people on their team. And I don't really even know necessarily the specifics of how that team does their work. And yet, if I granted that manager some level of autonomy and I believed in the competence that they have, then I could actually delegate a level of authority, not believing that everything has to be the same for everybody, but equality still the goal. I think we could make this work for individuals by giving managers a level of authority and autonomy in this process. And I think negotiation could be met on both sides, that the executive team and leadership would get what they want, and the individual people would get some level of autonomy in what they want.
And with that, just being the the other side of the equation, with that freedom to make customized decisions for each individual or each team or whatever the case might be, there would come the expectations and accountability. And so that wouldn't get compromised in any way. The manager would be held accountable for the productivity of their team. And if their team on an individual basis starts not to be productive, then the manager and the team may have to revisit how to get back to the standard of performance that they're expected to achieve. And at that point, they may have to make a different decision. But once you get to that point, now you've created a lot of motivation for people, number one, to perform well, given the freedom that they have. But then they also have to know that if they abuse that freedom and they're not productive, that the consequence is they will have to come back to work. And the hope is that motivation right there, that motivation is going to be more powerful, more influential than the motivation of just complying with a corporate policy.
Yep. And John, what it actually says then, if all of that is true, what it says is that if I'm going to sort of a blanket statement, get everybody back to the office, what I actually believe is that people who come to an office and sit in a chair and fill a space are productive. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's my belief. Mm-hmm. But yet we don't always even have the performance metrics to measure the performance of people who are sitting in our offices, sure, let alone work remotely. And so it's our fault. If we don't have the ability to actually determine whether people are productive or not, mm-hmm, just coming back to an office and filling a seat doesn't help anything. It might make me feel better because I can see people in an office, but it hasn't solved any of the actual productivity that we're trying to solve for.
Sure. So what else have you learned from this case study? Before we leave it, this is just a perfect case study in terms of negotiating in the workplace. Any other advice or any other lessons that you've learned in terms of consulting with, I'm sure, countless number of companies on this particular issue?
Yeah, I think this would be my consulting wisdom would be careful about making decisions at a certain level and not actually bringing other people into the collaborative effort of making that decision. Because what I've seen is that at the executive level, you already have certain freedoms and flexibility. You typically already have autonomy over how you do your work. And so you're making a decision from your perspective without the insight of talking to other people. So I would just say the organizations who have negotiated their way through this well have brought a lot of different stakeholders to the table to gain the perspective of the single mom, the young employee, the person who has to commute a long way, the individual who doesn't actually feel like they need to collaborate, but gain different perspectives in the process. And that will help win people over. And I just think that that's probably a proper way to handle the negotiation or the change management.
Okay. So this is going to be a lot of fun. I've never done this with a guest, but you and I have accomplished a lot together over the years, and I think we can pull this off. But we're going to go on a total experimentation here, okay?
All right.
So what we're going to do is we're going to help people build a framework for collaboration within their organization. And the way that we're going to do it is you're going to go first with the first step. I'm going to follow it with the second. Then you're going to follow me with the next step. And we're going to go until we think we've got a complete framework built, and people will have a very practical approach based upon this in terms of how to build. Maybe it's a mindset, maybe it's a framework, whatever you want to call it. But how is it that we foster more collaboration and less combativeness as we negotiate through difficult moments in the workplace. You get to go first with the first step.
Value a person.
Love it. Talk more about it.
All right. So at the root of everything in the world is a relationship between two people.
Okay.
And if we think about what people need, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if we think about motivation, if we think about self-determination theory or any of these other psychological concepts, it all comes back down to an individual feeling valued. So the way that I can make an individual feel valued is by actually getting to know them personally, understand what motivates them, understand their goals, their uniqueness. And if I take the time as a leader to get to know somebody and value them, that is the first step. If I haven't taken time to value a person, the negotiation has already gone bad. That is the first step.
All right. Ready for step 2?
Yep.
Step 2 is take control of the process. Most importantly within that is the communication. And so before you try to solve the problem, before you begin to generate ideas or solutions on what can be done, the most important place to focus after you valued the people is to say, okay, my job, if I want to be successful in this moment, I've got to manage the process very carefully and very strategically. And I've got to make sure that it's a process that's fair. It's a process that people have the opportunity to provide input in. But I've also got to make sure it's a productive process. It's not one that just stalls in the avoidance of conflict, because that's the most comfortable way to deal with conflict. It's got to be a process that stays moving toward a solution, even if that requires some difficult conversations. And then in the context of that, the most important part of the process to manage well is the communication. And to make sure that the communication is open, to make sure that it's respectful, to make sure that people feel safe, to your point earlier, to communicate what they need to communicate, but then also to make sure that it's productive, to where people, it's not just a gripe fest, but people are beginning to move from, okay, here's a description of the problem, to here's some ideas in terms of how we might solve this problem and move forward. So there's step 2, manage the process, specifically the communication.
All right. So if you value the person, then you manage the process. I would say step 3 is ask more questions. And okay. I think that it's part of the process that you were talking about around communication. But unfortunately, most people forget that asking a question and getting the other person to actually talk is a form of valuing them. It's also a form of getting them to buy in. But we are so quick to want to do the talking that we're always trying to convince somebody that our direction or our process or our decision is right, instead of just saying, hey, here's what I'm up against. Here's the process that I've put in place. How do you feel about this? Where will you have problems with this? How will you respond to this? Do you think other colleagues of yours will buy in? And I think that next step of just don't forget to ask the questions is where I would go next. Now, inherent in that is that the person feels valued because you're asking them questions, and they're going to give you really valuable data on how your process is going to be responded to. There's 3.
Okay. Step 4. I would say step 4 is, I'm debating between 2. I'm going to go with this one. So I think step 4 is, and it's going to seem obvious, but it's not obvious. And that is that step 4, we really have to listen. We got to ask those questions, but then we really have to listen. And what I mean by that is, a lot of people can say, what are you talking about, John? Like listening, like, of course you're going to listen to the answers to the questions. But what I'm talking about is listening is actually really hard for people. And the reason that it's hard for people is because people are really bright and their mind can process more information at a faster pace than people can talk. And so what happens is, as people are talking, other people their minds are already solving the problem. They're like, oh, well, yeah, of course, if that's how you feel, then we should do this or we should do that. And so what happens is they go too quick into the problem solving mode without doing what you just talked about in terms of accomplishing this idea of saying, okay, now the person feels heard. Now the person feels like there is this kind of collaborative effort that's going to go on to try to solve this problem, and they're going to have an opportunity to kind of provide that input. And as a result of that, as you listen and as you confirm what's really going on, it actually may shape if you allow it to, it will shape your beliefs and your confirmation bias that eventually is going to lead to whatever those solutions are. And we'll get there eventually in this process. But this is a very intentional moment that lots of people skip over. And because they don't listen well, and I can share lots of stories where I'm guilty of this, they miss something that becomes really, really important and could have been the key to success, could have been the key to a more efficient resolution had they just slowed their minds down enough to actually listen. So I would say step 4 is to be intentional about listening.
Awesome. Okay. I was thinking about a number of different things too while you were talking. Let me just go to sort of a next step here. I think after I've listened to individuals, I would actually like to pull a group together to come up with a collaborative decision. Now, before you think that I'm just going to leave the decision-making process up to other people, one of the greatest arts of a leader or an artist would be the ability to actually have a decision made, walk into a collaborative environment, and through conversation, get a group of people to completely buy in to the right solution. Now, if as a leader, I have asked the right questions, I've put the right process in place, I've now listened, I should actually have a pretty good concept of where this group wants to go. I won't get everyone on board, but if I could collaboratively get that group to actually give me some viable solutions, I'm one step closer to being able to give the solution. And the way that I would state that is, hey, listen, I want to bring you in to collaborate on this. Ultimately, I know that I will have to make this decision. It may not make everybody happy, but in the best interest of the most people, I'm going to end up having to make this. And so I need your help in this process. Let's collaborate. And I would attempt to get people to buy into the best solution through negotiation.
Okay, so the next step then, I think, is kind of obvious, and that is that, a decision has to get made at some point. Otherwise, this rambles on forever and becomes inefficient. And so there's the moment where you have to make the decision. But as you make the decision, then this is the moment where things shift a little bit to where it's really, really important that if you've executed the process right, in order to honor the process and everyone who spoke into it, you have to make the decision boldly, and you've got to be committed to the decision. Otherwise, then this process becomes something that people lose faith in if it doesn't lead to actual decisions, and as a result of those decisions, positive change. Now, if you get the decision wrong, then, and it's clear that you got it wrong, always be willing to revisit it. But as you make that decision, I think it's important to make it with a level of confidence, not in your own ego or your own wisdom, but in the wisdom of the group that led you to the decision that you ultimately concluded on.
I love it. Okay, I got one other thought, and that is to now communicate with that confident decision why you made the decision.
Sure.
And I think people understanding why a leader made a decision is a step that is often left out. And we often say, in the absence of information, people make up stories. Mm-hmm. And so if I can communicate why I made the decision that I made. And now they would already understand the process. They would understand that people are feeling valued. They've been asked questions. They've been listened to. They've been collaborated with. And those things can happen really quickly. But now I'm going to go back and I'm going to say, here's the decision that I've had to make. Mm-hmm. I understand it might not make everybody happy, but here's why I made the decision. Here's as much information as I can give you. And for further conversations on it, if you have questions, our management team, our managers, your leader, whomever, will be available to talk through how this affects you personally. But let me tell you why.
Awesome. All right. So 7 is a beautiful number. It's a sacred number at some level. So we're gonna wrap it at 7 in terms of 7, unless you have something that has to push it to 8. I'm going to see if we can't wrap this up at 7.
Wrap it.
And so 7 would be you've got to evaluate, you got to measure the decision to make sure that it's the right decision. But then based upon what the data suggests on the evaluation, you either have to revisit it and go back through the process, or you got to move on. You got to move the organization forward. It can't get stuck in these things forever. Otherwise, you create this culture of conflict that is really damaging. And so, yes, there is a need to evaluate, and you either revisit or you move on. And you got to lead people and the conversation and the focus and the attention. If you got it right, you solve the problem, move on. And that will give people a sense of closure in terms of that particular issue. And that would be step number 7.
I love it. John, this is not anything additional. I would just say that the caution is oftentimes things bubble up to leaders, and they're phrased this way. They are upset.
Yeah.
They don't like this decision.
Yeah.
They feel this way. And I get phone calls from leaders all the time under the terminology of they, and I'll ask, like, who is they?
Who's that? Yeah.
Who is they? And they don't know. Mm-hmm. They is never really identified. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes they is 1 or 2 people. And so I just think make that decision confidently, give the why, evaluate it, but move forward. You will never please everybody. There will be maybe 1 or 2 people who don't like your decision. And yet, if you've made that decision to the best of your ability, following this 7-step process that we just, I guess, came up with, you've done everything you possibly can to value people in the process. And you got to move forward. You got to move forward.
There you go. All right. 7 steps to effective negotiation in the workplace. That was great fun. Thanks for playing along. Hopefully those are helpful. I think they will be. If people follow those 7 steps, there's a lot that they can overcome, and overcome in a way that when they get to the backside of it, the team's actually stronger and the organization's actually stronger. So thanks for thinking that through with me. So last question, Chris, give me as you look at kind of the world we're in today, chaos everywhere. As you look at the workplace, one of the things that I think is so interesting about the workplace is people are looking to the workplace for so much of life, and it puts managers in such a tough spot. Their self-worth, their connections, their social outreach and connectivity, their sense of purpose in the world. I mean, there's just a lot of this that is playing out in the workplace. And poor managers, they used to be like, man, I used to come and just make sure that, people were productive from this time to this time. And that's what it was about. Now it's much more complex to that. So what's kind of the single piece of advice that you would give managers today who are trying to lead in this very complex world that we live in?
So the simplest piece of advice would be that the purpose of leadership is to develop people. So if you are a manager or a leader who thought that your job description was to tell people what to do, to be the best at something, to show people your way of doing it, you've missed the memo on leadership. The simplest form of advice on this would just be, in today's world of chaos, anxiety, loneliness, many broken structures in society, we need more leaders who take their role seriously, who believe that I'm in this role of leadership to develop people. And sometimes that means that I'm going to get into some really interesting stuff, because people have come out of situations, out of families, out of brokenness, out of education systems, academic situations where they're not solving problems. Who knows what it is? But all of that has created belief systems which are now showing themselves as behaviors. So my job as a leader is to help develop people by valuing them, seeing them, by helping them feel competent, giving them autonomy, inviting them into relationship, by meeting their needs in the workplace, because all of us will spend about a third of our lives at work. Mm-hmm. Some people estimate 90,000 to 100,000 hours during our life. And so if you break life into thirds, we'll sleep for a third, we'll work for a third, and we'll spend time with our loved ones a third. And so what a unique opportunity to be in a place of leadership where you could actually develop people. Instead of thinking of that as like, oh man, what a detriment, I can't believe I have to do that. What if you just reframed it as like, I can't believe I get to do this. What an opportunity, what a privilege to be involved in people's lives to help develop them into whatever's next in their career. There's my simplicity.
There it is. Well, your concluding thought there reminds me of something that my father would say at times. And he was a university president for 16 years. And he says, my book on leadership, I can never write, because he said, so much of my leadership was working with people through their stuff just to help them get through the day and be effective in terms of their mission, serving the university and its students. And he said, those are things about people that you'd never write about, never publish. But he said, that's really the mark of a leader these days, in terms of developing people and serving people and helping people get through what people are having to deal with these days, so that they can get back to the mission and the work that is before them.
Yeah.
Chris, thank you so much. This has been great fun. I don't know if these 7 things are going anywhere or not, but boy, was that a fun process in terms of creating that with you. A productive hour, a fun hour. Thanks for all you're doing. Chris's company is Always About People. I encourage you to look it up. And Chris does a lot of work with our clients here at Thrivance, and does an outstanding job in terms of working with executive teams and leaders across companies in terms of helping create thriving cultures and helping people do their best at leading other people. So I encourage you to look Chris up and check out Always About People.
Thanks, John. It's fun.
Well, that's a first on the Negotiation Made Simple podcast. I have never created a process with a guest live on the show like I just did with Chris Allen, which was tremendous fun. Chris is such a brilliant thinker. He's got so many wonderful insights, and he likes to have a lot of fun, which is why I knew that we could come up with something kind of interesting and kind of fun as far as thinking about how to most effectively manage negotiation in the workplace. So as you go forward in terms of creating an incredible environment for you and your employees and the people that work for you, or maybe the people that you work for, I hope you'll remember these 7 steps. These 7 steps, I think, can be exceptionally valuable to you as you negotiate success in the place where you work. Thanks for listening to the Negotiation Made Simple podcast. I look forward to seeing you soon on the next episode.